Well, it's Holy Week, and we are on our way to Good Friday, Last Supper, crucifixion, and the culmination is the resurrection. The resurrection is, and I don't think I'm alone in this, the resurrection is the most important event in all of human history, and it is central to our Christian faith. Recorded historically, not just legendary, but historically recorded in the Bible. And if we don't have a resurrection, we don't have a faith. Paul says that. Without the resurrection, our faith is in vain. So it's absolutely critical. I mean, it's even more important than Christmas, in my opinion. Christmas is critical. You have to have a birth before you can get to the crucifixion and the resurrection. But without the crucifixion and the resurrection, we don't have a Savior. So we're lost.
We're all going to hell.
Yeah, so we're still lost. Thankfully, we do have a Savior. Thankfully, there was a resurrection. And it is proven historically. The Bible doesn't make it easy for us because we have 4 different accounts and they read very differently. Like I said in my text that I sent out, how many women went to the tomb? Was it just Mary and the other Mary, or was it 4 women, or was it more? The Gospels don't seem to agree. How many angels were there? Was there 1? Was there 2? The Gospels don't seem to agree. What did the women say when they went back to the disciples after seeing the tomb? The Gospels don't seem to agree, and yet they do. When you read them and read them back and forth and look at the different parts of the details that are told, it tells one big, amazing story. But the world wants to really challenge us as believers on this. And this is the part that is really discouraging and sad as I see, not only myself, I decided I needed to work through this, but so many of us don't know how to answer these questions when the culture wants to say, come on, how many women went? The Gospels don't agree. And how come, she says in John, she says something completely different to the disciples than what she says in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? What's the answer to that? Most of us can't answer. We don't know. And it leaves us kind of stumbling. And then we walk away and there's a seed of doubt that can be planted. It's like, I really don't know why. Why are the Gospels so different? That little voice gets going in our head. And that can be corrosive. And so I said, I wanted to understand this. So I've been researching this over the last couple of years over and over again, and also looked at commentaries online, and there's lots of commentaries that explain these different. Now, none of them really seem to agree. Not exactly, right? And that's fine. Everybody has a little bit of a different opinion on exactly what happened and in what order did it happen on that morning. So we're going to get into this, and we're going to find out. So right out of the gate, here's some images that represent the empty tomb. This image right here is incorrect because the women were not at the tomb the same time the guards were there. They just weren't, and the Bible confirms that, and we'll talk about that. So this is a misrepresentation that, it's a mistake on the part of the artist, but Todd, it says right here, after the Sabbath, at the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, and for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were as white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him, they shook and became like dead men. The angels said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said." I mean, this right here seems to tell us the women, the angel, the guards, how come they weren't all there at the same time? They weren't, and I can explain that. The gospel writers, they did not write their stories the same way we would write stories today. We write stories today, and we want to make sure we take the reader through a timeline of events. So we want to give them the context, and then this person said this, and this person said that, and we want to make sure we don't lose the reader as we're going through the story. And whenever there's a change in time, or we go to a different point in time, we're careful to say that. A few days later, the next day, so we know that we're leaving this moment and we're going to another moment. The gospel writers didn't do that. The gospel writers, they have a mission. They want to communicate the important details that there was Jesus, that he is deity, that he is the Messiah, that he rose. That's the important things that they want to tell us. So they don't tell us every detail of the story. And Matthew doesn't here. And I'll explain this one here later as we go on. Here's another picture. The tomb is just too big. It just gives us a wrong impression. And when we read about the women went into the tomb, we get the idea that they're going into this big cavernous space. And it wasn't. The tomb was very small. This is the garden tomb in Jerusalem. this is believed to be possibly, maybe, the tomb of Jesus. They can't confirm it. They do believe, however, that this tomb would represent a very similar representation of what the tomb probably was. It's very small. Heather and Jack and I, we went to this, and it's really small. You walk into the tomb, and it's probably this big right here, wouldn't you say? It's just about like that, just enough room for about 4 people to fit inside the room. Very small, so it's not big. And it's important to know that it is very small because that helps us to understand what the gospel writers are probably trying to say when they say the women went into the tomb. They went into the tomb. We'll get to that. Another location, the more traditional location, is inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this is the church that was built over it. This is Jack and Heather and I and some of our friends, and we went there. And inside, we got very lucky. Normally, it's like a 2 to 3 hour wait to get in to see this tomb. We walked right in. It was a miracle. And I've never seen it that accessible. So here is the inside of what they believe was the tomb of Jesus according to the Roman Catholic tradition. This is Jack standing inside the tomb. Heather and another friend are on Jack's left, and I'm on his right. And by the way, you're not supposed to take pictures inside the tomb, but tell me not to take a picture, right? So see how tiny it is? Very, very small. Very, very small. So keep that in mind. Okay, that's important to know as we go on. So the gospel writers. So who were the gospel writers? So 4 authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 2 of them were members of the 12 disciples, Matthew and John. Luke and Mark were not. Mark was a disciple, but he was not one of the 12. Which, by the way, how many disciples did Jesus have? Trick question. It's not 12. There were many disciples, many people that called themselves disciples of Jesus, but there were 12 that were his inner core. And when the Bible talks about the disciples, it's talking about those 12. But a disciple is just a student of a rabbi. So there were many people that were following Jesus through his 3-year ministry that called themselves disciples and could legitimately say they were disciples. They were students of Jesus. But Jesus had his 12 that were the core. And inside that core were James, John, and Peter. Those were his 3, really close inside that 12. Yeah, that's right. Okay. So that's interesting to know who they were. Matthew was a Jew. He was writing primarily to a Jewish audience. And he was making the case that Jesus is the Messiah because of all of the Old Testament, well, not Old Testament to them, of course, but to the Old Testament prophecies. Matthew quotes the Old Testament 100 times, over 100 times in his full gospel. He's over and over and over again proving, making the case, this is the Messiah. It says it here. Then he did this, and it was prophesied here, and he did this, and prophesied here. 100 times he does that throughout his gospel. So Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience, citing Jewish scriptures that they would know. Mark, a disciple, he was one of the youngest, not one of the 12. His gospel is often also referred to as the gospel also of Peter, because Mark and Peter were very close, and Mark talked with Peter a lot, and they shared notes. So scholars really agree that Peter influenced Mark a lot as he wrote his gospel. Luke probably never met Jesus. He was a Gentile, and he was a physician, that he was brought to the faith by Philip, I think. He was discipled by Philip and was a good friend of Paul's. So Luke wrote his gospel after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. Luke spent a lot of time interviewing people in the region. He probably interviewed, they estimate he interviewed probably hundreds of people. In particular, he interviewed the women. He spent a lot of time talking to the women who were in that inner circle with Jesus. So his gospel, many times, is written in the reference to the women and from their perspective. And then John, so the first 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they call those the synoptic gospels because they're very similar in the point of view that they tell the story. So synoptics, synonym, one, optic view, a singular point of view. Those 3 are very similar. John's, though, is very different. Again, he's one of the 12, and he was writing about the love and the ministry, and his is very theological about who Jesus was. He's, John, the famous John 3:16, right? For God gave his only begotten Son, those types of passages. And John opens up his gospel with, in the beginning was the Word, Jesus, right? And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So he establishes who Jesus is right out of the gate. So those are the 4 writers, and they're writing to 4 very different audiences.
And that was the John that was beloved by Jesus, and he was
Right.
the one that was sent off to the island.
Patmos, right?
Yeah.
Right. So he writes Revelation. He's the only apostle.
He wasn't martyred.
Yeah, he's the only one that wasn't martyred. John referred to himself as the one Jesus loved.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's kind of fun. And I'll show you. I'll point that out here at one point. But I think it's kind of fun. He doesn't come right out and say, Jesus loved me. He just, John, the
I'm
one
his
Jesus
favorite.
loved. Yeah, I was his favorite. Right. All right. The gospel authors did not write their stories to us. We make the mistake in reading them as if they were writing to us. They didn't. They were writing to a specific audience, contemporary in their time and in their region, in a language that they would understand. Now, God wrote the entire Bible through human authors. God is writing to us. But I think if the four gospel writers, if we could get them the hot tub time machine, catapult them into modern day, and they could look back over the last 2,000 years, I think it would blow their minds to know that what they wrote 2,000 years ago has persisted for this long and has been the most argued, the most studied, the most debated, the most quoted writings of all time. I think it would blow their mind. They had no concept when they were writing the Gospels just how far this was going to go. They knew Jesus was the Savior. They knew he was the Messiah, and they knew that was a big deal. But I don't think they could have conceived that 2,000 years later, we would still be arguing this. They thought Jesus was coming back really, really soon. They figured maybe even before my lifetime, right? They could not have conceived what has happened the last 2,000 years. And I think the four gospel writers, if they could see how much we have argued over their gospels, they would probably say, wow, if I would have known that, I probably would have written it totally different, right? So there wasn't this debate. That's the humans in them. God, on the other hand, would say, it was perfect then, and it's perfect now. You wrote exactly what I inspired you to write. It's fine. But the humans in them, I think, like I would, probably be like, wow, I had no idea. So the first century authors, they were writing their stories for contemporary audiences that they knew to answer specific questions that they think their audience would have or needed to know. So the language of the Gospels. So the New Testament is written primarily, the original writings are in Koine Greek, which just means common Greek, right? The Greeks had conquered this land. We read about this in Daniel, and the Greeks had conquered this land, centuries before. So they really pretty much, it was the culture that was the majority culture in the area. If you wanted to do business, if you wanted to trade, if you wanted to be able to communicate with somebody on the other side of the Mediterranean, you had to speak Greek. So everybody spoke Greek, which is why they wrote their Gospels primarily in Greek, all right? And what about the Greek? This helps us to understand how the original writings get translated to today and how we have to understand that they are a little bit different than the way we write today. So this is Greek. This is 1 Corinthians, a passage from 1 Corinthians. But the first thing you'll notice is in all these Greek manuscripts, there's no punctuation, everything is capitalized, there's no punctuation, and there's no spacing between the words. All right? So that makes it a little bit interesting. Now, for those who can read Greek, it's not hard at all. Just like for those of us who can read English, read this with me. How hard is that? It doesn't take much, right? I dropped the punctuation. I don't put the periods in there. There's no spaces. And yet you can pretty much figure out where the sentence pretty much ends. Now, it reads like one big run-on sentence, and that's important to also keep that in mind because that's kind of how the gospel writers had to write. Another thing to keep in mind is that just the practical exercise of writing down anything in antiquity. You had papyrus, which is not easy to come by. It's not like you can just run down to the Office Depot and just get you another ream of paper. And I'm kind of making a joke, but really, they're limited in how much material they have to write on, first of all, and it's also very laborious to write, right? So they chose their words very carefully. They told the details that they wanted to tell. They didn't get into the details that were not important, at least in their mind, and so that's why there's so many gaps in the different Gospels from one to the other. So the Gospels are not, and this is important, they are not a detailed, comprehensive accounting of the events like in modern legal documents today, or otherwise a narrative that we might write today. We make the mistake of reading the Bible, in particular the New Testament, like we read legal documents today, right? If it says it, That's what it's in there. If it doesn't say it, then it's not applicable to this contract, right? That's how we read our legal contracts today. The Bible isn't like that at all. So we got to get ourselves in the frame of mind of who the gospel writers are, first century writers, who the audience is that they're talking to. They are summaries. The stories are summaries of the important events. And they also don't follow the timeline, as I mentioned before. They'll tell me something that happens, and when that point is made, they'll go on to another point that I want to tell you. And we read it sometimes thinking, that happened immediately after this happened. And that's not the case at all. So I want you to know that this happened. Got it? Okay, now I want you to know that this happened. Well, this happened 3 days later, right? But they don't bother telling us 3 days later. Not always. Every now and then they do, but not always. That creates confusion because we read it wrong when we read the Gospels. So what they want to do is they want to affirm the deity of Christ, that he is the Messiah, and that he is a Savior. All right, context. This is also important. This is Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem. Here's the Temple Mount. Church of the Holy Sepulchre, by the way, is over here. That's one of the locations that they think it could be the crucifixion and burial site of Jesus, is over here, right there, okay? This is the border. This is the old city of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. It's grown outside of this, but this wall represents where Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. This right here, this is the city of David. So when you hear about Jesus went down to the city of David, or somebody goes down to the city of David, they're going from here to here. Okay? Not a long walk. But that's just how they talked about things. So cities were not quite as big as what we think they are. For example, you are here. This is the village of Chapel Glen, Coronado. These two pictures are to scale. That's the city of Jerusalem overlaid on top of the neighborhood you're in. So the city of Jerusalem is a city only in name according to Jews at the time. It's not a big place. It's about the size of Chapel Glen and Coronado and just a little bit south of Rockville Road. That's it. That's also important to keep that in mind because we're going to understand later how word gets around in the city of Jerusalem pretty quickly. Very quickly. All right?
And didn't they say,
Mm-hmm.
that,
That's right.
like, wherever he went, Capernaum and
Capernaum.
the different little cities, was only like 6 square miles or something small like that because they had to walk everywhere.
Up at the Sea of Galilee, which is a couple hours north of Jerusalem, where he spent most of his time in his ministry, Magdala, where Mary is from, right? And Capernaum and Bethsaida and, all those. I mean, it's a lake. It's not a sea. It's a lake. By our definition today, it's a lake. It's a big lake, but it's a lake nonetheless. I think it's 5 miles across and something like 7 or 8 miles in this direction here. It's a big lake. But we could see across the whole thing. We saw, but when we were there 2 years ago, Jack and Heather and I, it was the windiest I've ever seen it. It was so windy. I mean, the wind was it was relentless the whole week that we were there. And we went to Galilee. And the Bible talks about the storm on the sea. And the disciples, they were scared that they were going to drown, right?
That's when Jesus walked on the water.
Right, exactly. It was so windy that there were waves cresting on what we would call a big lake, but the wind is coming off of the Mediterranean Sea, unblocked, and just 15 miles inland is the Sea of Galilee. And so it's rolling that water over, and it gets very choppy for being otherwise a big lake. So we actually stood there, and we saw, wow, it really does get pretty violent out there when it's really windy.
Where is the Gaza Strip?
The Gaza Strip is way down south, so this is not a map at all. This is just Jerusalem. Well, that's Chapel Glen there. Let's go back to Jerusalem. So,
in Chapel Glen.
I wish I had an overlay, but I could show you that.
But it's south.
The entire country of Israel would fit inside Indiana, pretty much. From north to south tip, it will pretty much fit inside the state of Indiana. Yeah. So, okay, side note here. I'm going to digress for just a second, but the West Bank is the land. The West Bank area starts right here and heads this way. Okay, that's the part that's disputed, and then on the other side of that is Jordan. All right. Okay, so we're in the middle of Holy Week right now. We just had Palm Sunday. Jesus enters the city like a king, but not a conquering king. Not a conquering king. Just like Zechariah predicted. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout, daughter Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Written 500 years before it happened. So let's get into this. So these are the gospel accounts. So these are all for everything we know about the empty tomb, the day of the empty tomb. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So let's get into a few of the questions, all right? So what time of day was it? Critics can't even get past the first line of the Gospels because it says right here, after the Sabbath, at dawn. Mark says, very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, just after sunrise. Luke says, the first day of the week, very early in the morning. And John says, on the first day of the week, while it was still dark. They can't even get past the first line. They're saying, he says it was right after dawn. He's saying it was still dark. They can't even agree on what time it is. And I would say, relax. We all do this. We all say things in certain ways, and we understand what we mean. Now, if I were to say, I'm going to get up very early in the morning, somebody might think I'm getting up before dawn, right? Like when I was with the men's ministry out we're taking men in the wilderness, early in the morning would be 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. We got to get up early. We got to get things ready. You can start to see the sun getting, or the sky's getting kind of glowy over here in the east because the sun's starting to come up. To us, it's morning, right? It's time to get up. That's morning. Somebody else would say, it's still pitch black. Go back to sleep, right? So it's not a contradiction at all. It's just how they chose to write the story. And also, what happened in the morning is Mary gets up and she goes and gets with the other women. So she's spending time probably going from house to house as they're meeting, and they say, I'll meet you at your house and let's go over here and then we'll meet. So the women are getting together. So the journey for them probably started before dawn. So John's saying it started before dawn. Mark and Matthew, they're picking it up where it's just after sunrise. Well, they're probably leaving Jerusalem now and heading to the tomb. So it's not a contradiction. It's just how they chose to tell the story and set the scene for us. So who were the first to see the empty tomb? This is a lot of fun. Who was the first to see the empty tomb? It tells us there was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, his clothes were as white as snow, and the guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The guards. They were the first to see the empty tomb. That's important. Keep that in mind. The guards saw the empty tomb first, and they fled and went back to the city. It could have been 3, 4 in the morning. We don't know. Very, very early in the morning. So in the middle of the night, perhaps. Something else to keep in mind is how the Jews keep track of their days. The Jewish day starts at sunset. So this day is about to end. Right? This Wednesday is going to end. As soon as the sun sets, Wednesday is over. Thursday starts for the Jews. Now, they understand the Gregorian calendar that we use today and how we measure days, and they live with that. But still to this day, that's how they observe their days. Sabbath, the Sabbath, which is Saturday for the Jew, starts on Friday night at sunset and goes until Saturday night at sunset. Keep that in mind. That's how they measure their days. So the guards were the first to see the tomb empty. So then, here's something else. What I want to share with you here, this is from Matthew. This is before the empty tomb part. This is after the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. Look what happens here. This is a little pre-sequel here. Prequel. The next day, after the crucifixion and the burial, the one after preparation day, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate, and they said, Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver, Jesus, said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell people that he has been raised from the dead. The last deception will be worse than the first. Okay, well then take a guard, Pilate answered. Go make the tomb as secure as you know. And so they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on the stone and posting it. This is important. The Pharisees were already anticipating something, and they already were prepared to answer it. So there's a conspiracy already starting before the tomb is even opened. Okay, this happens before Easter Sunday. All right? Now, how many soldiers were there? Pilate says, take a guard. in the Roman guard, the smallest group of Roman guard would be 4 quaternions, okay? That would be 4. Bible doesn't say if he means take my guards, or if he means, in another gospel, he says you have a guard. He could be meaning you have a guard from me, or he could be saying you have your own guards, meaning the temple guards. So if it's Jewish temple guards at the tomb, then that's still going to be several. So there's several guards at the tomb. That's important. Keep that in mind. So then also, this is important, after the women go to the tomb, I'm going to jump down here to the bottom of Matthew's empty tomb account. Let's keep this in mind. While the women were on their way to the tomb, some of the guards went to the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with these elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say the disciples came during the night and stole him away while you were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money, did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. So there's the conspiracy that was already happening.
Is that why a lot of the Jews still
today
think that?
Yeah.
So that's why I wondered why they didn't. Okay.
One of the reasons, one of the things that the Jews use today to dismiss the account of the resurrection in the empty tomb. All right, so keep all that in mind. The guards were the first to see it. They ran to Jerusalem, talked to the chief priests and the Pharisees. There's a conspiracy already happening before the women are even at the tomb. So how many women went to the tomb? All right, Matthew talks about Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mark says Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome. Luke says it was Mary, Joanna, Mary, mother of James, and others. And then John just talks about Mary Magdalene. I mean, look here at Luke, he talks about Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and others, which would have to be at least 2 more. So there was at least 5 according to Luke. But does that agree with Mark and Matthew? Does that agree with John? John only talks about 1. How come John didn't tell us about the other women? I mean, isn't that important for us to know how many women went and who they were? No, it's not. It's not important. Not to each of these different author writers, okay? I'm going to give you an example. We're here at the house, okay? Heather realizes she needs something from the store. And Natalie, let's say you're over visiting, right? And I say, Heather, I need you to run to the store and pick up something for me. Heather says, okay, I'll go to the store. She says, Natalie, you want to go with me? Sure. So you guys head out the door. On the way out, they run into Nancy. Brain fart. Sorry. Too many names. Run into Nancy. You know I know you. I've known you for 20 years. They run into Nancy and they say, hey, we're heading to the store. You want to go with us? Sure. So the 3 of you take off to the store. Okay? Wendy comes over and says, hey, where's Heather? I would in all likelihood say, well, Heather and Natalie and Nancy went to the store to get some. They'll be right back. I would have told you all 3 because you know all 3. However,
I walked through the house.
let's say, yeah. Let's say that Lori and Brian happen to stop by, and Brian says, hey, where's Heather? I would probably say to them, Heather went to the store to get something. She'll be right back. I probably wouldn't even mention the other 2 because you don't know those other 2. And it's not integral. You just want to know about Heather. It's very similar in the way the gospel writers write to their audience. Their audience, in all likelihood, knew these different people. They knew the disciples. They knew their names. They were familiar with Mary. Mary was, in all likelihood, Mary was probably the leader among the women in the disciples, which is why she gets mentioned every time. And so depending on who the gospel writers were writing to, they just wanted them to know that, Mary and the other Mary and Salome. Remember Salome, right? So he mentions Salome. Luke mentions, Mark mentions Salome. Mark is probably writing to an audience that he knows Salome. So he's going to mention her as well. So that's why.
And John is the only one who thought it was important to mention that he beat Peter to the tomb.
Exactly. You beat me to the punch. I was holding out for later. I know. I love that. That's exactly right.
That was funny.
It is funny. The difference between his gospel and is it Mark's? It's the difference between Mark's, right? Yeah.
Don't you kind of think, too, it's like that game telephone where you tell him something and...
Yes and no. We'll deal with that.
Okay.
That's a very common criticism about the different translations, that they're all just one big story of... Yeah, That's just one big game of telephone, and that the original Gospels have been so corrupted over time that what we have today is not what we have today. Yeah, well, that's a criticism, and they use the telephone example. I'll deal with that in a minute. That's in here.
Interesting. There's different names listed, but none of them refute and say only Mary.
Right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. John doesn't say only Mary. He just says Mary went, because John's figuring his audience is familiar with Mary. She was, in all likelihood, she was the one leading the ladies to the tomb that morning. It's just important Mary went, right? But it's also the agenda that they have. And I don't mean a nefarious agenda. I mean, they're on a mission to make sure that their audience knows certain things. Okay. How many angels were at the tomb? Here we go again. Right? It's over here in Matthew. For an angel of the Lord. And the angel said, Mark says, they saw a young man. One. Luke says, suddenly two men. And John, two angels were there. Okay, now this is another big bone of contention that the world wants to throw at us. Is how many angels were there? There's two or there's one. Don't you think that's important? No, it's not important. And the other question is, how many angels spoke to the women? Once again, let's look at what it says here. Over there, the angel said to the women, do not be afraid, yada, yada. Don't be alarmed. He said, one, you were looking for Jesus. Over here, but the men said to them, why are you looking for the living among the dead? They asked her, why are you crying? It sounds like they both spoke, only one spoke. Which is it? I'll give you another example. Okay, from our world. Here we are back in Chapel Glen. So for you guys, this is the green belt in our neighborhood right here. And this is our pool, this is our clubhouse, this is a parking lot, this is a basketball court, okay? We just call it the green belt. All right, so here's an example. Jack and his buddy Christopher and Pat, all right? Three buddies. They say to the moms, hey, we're going to go hang on the green belt for a while, okay? So they go to hang out on the green belt. They're down on the basketball court. They're on the basketball court. Follow the story carefully, please, because the details are important. I'm going to explain why, and you're going to see why it explains the angels, one or two spoke. They're on the basketball court. A police car pulls up. In the police car are two police officers. The officer driving rolls the window down, motions to the boys to come over. The boys go over to the parking lot, which is right next to the basketball court. The officer driving the car says, boys, there's a storm coming. Probably a tornado. You should probably head home. And with that, the boys went home. Jack walks in the door and says to his mom, says, back so soon? Jack says, well, we were down at the Greenbelt, and a police officer came up and told us that there was a storm coming. We should probably head home. Christopher walks in the door. Wendy says, back so soon? Christopher says, well, we were down at the basketball courts, and two police officers pulled up, and they told us that there's a storm coming. We should probably head home. Pat walks in his house, and his mom says, back so soon? And Pat says, well, we were down at the clubhouse, and the police came and told us that there was a storm coming, probably a tornado. We should probably head home. Which one is accurate? They all are, right? Neither one of them is wrong. It's just how we tell stories. It's how we explain things, right? So what happened there was there were two angels. There were two angels. The other Gospels don't say that there was only one. There were two angels. And what happened was that the one angel spoke. One angel spoke and just spoke on behalf of both of them. Just like the one officer spoke, I think it was Jack that said a police officer told us to go home. And he's speaking on behalf of both. No, I guess it was Christopher that said two police. That's right. He said they told us to go home. Well, only one officer spoke, right? He just means he spoke on behalf of both of them. I mean, collectively they were giving us a message. Only one of them spoke, but see what I mean? So that's not a contradiction either. That's easy to explain. Okay. Now, when or did the women even go into the tomb? When did they go into the tomb? Remember that the tomb is very, very small. So here, the angel said to the women, come and see the place, over here in Mark. But when they looked up, they saw that the stone was very large, been rolled away. And when they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white. Over here in Luke, they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple. So there's debate about when did they go into the tomb. But again, I want to remind you how small that tomb was. You would not have to actually physically go into the tomb and be standing inside the tomb. Sometimes it could just simply be that they poked their head in, and that would be enough to say that they entered the tomb. All right? And that's important too, because there's a little bit of exchange between the angels and the women when we're not sure, are they standing inside the tomb? Are they outside the tomb? They're right there at the tomb. One gospel writer describes it as they went in, meaning they poked their head in, but they didn't physically go into the tomb, and it could have just very well been Mary pokes her head in and looks. And the other women didn't even go in. So just like the one officer spoke for both, Mary could have poked her head in this tomb, and then later she's telling the story to the disciples of what happened, and they're just writing it down, saying the women went into the tomb. Making sense? Okay. Over here, Mark says, but when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, then they saw a young man dressed in a white robe. Luke says they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly two men in clothes gleamed like lightning and stood beside them. We'll deal with that. Let's look at Luke. Let's put these together. So Luke said, in their fright, the women bowed down their faces to the ground. Fear of the angels. What part does Mark tell us? But when they looked up, they saw the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white. So these could be very subtle moments in this brief exchange between the women and the angels that the two different gospel writers are talking about. That's all that's going on there. And so there's the two accounts from those two. So we can reasonably conclude that only one angel did the speaking on behalf of both angels. Now, I want to look at how gospel writers are telling their stories. So let's look at Matthew for just a second. Just Matthew alone, all right? Just Matthew. There's the whole story. Keeping in mind how first century authors write their stories. Now, I'm going to read something real quick to you here from, this is the New Testament. This is Greek to English. So it has the Greek here and it has the English over here. So you can go word by word. This is interesting, I think.
I want you to read the Greek side.
Yeah, I'm going to read the Greek side for you. Yeah, I knew you were going to ask for that. I want to show you how it sounds very different in Greek than how it sounds in our English. So reading from my NIV here, I'm going to start here where Jesus is in the wilderness being tempted by the devil. So listen to this, starting in verse 10. Jesus said to him, away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended to him. Verse 12. When Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he returned to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun. Clearly, two different moments, two different scenes. One, he's in the desert, and now the next one, he hears that John has been arrested. Clearly, a few days at least have passed, could be weeks even, have passed between those two different moments, right? Let's read in the Greek. Looking at the Greek. Now, here's something else to keep in mind. The Greek puts words in different order. So, like I would say, that's Debbie's chair. The Greek would say chair, the chair, Debbie's, right? So it flips it. So keep that in mind. And it also puts the in front of people's names for some reason, all over the place. So let's listen to that same passage in the Greek. Then, okay, now the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to read it as it's written in Greek. Some Greek words represent 2 or 3 or 4 English words. Okay, so I'm going to read it word by word by word, and when I read a group of words together, that's because there's one Greek word for that idea. Make sense? Okay. Does it? I just kind of assumed that it made sense. Doesn't make sense at all. Then he says to him, the Jesus, go away, Satan, it has been written, for Lord, the God, you will worship, and him only you will serve. Then leaves him the devil, and look, angels, having heard now that John, he was handed over, he withdrew into Galilee, and having left behind the Nazareth, having gone. Did you pick up where it left the desert? No. you got to pay attention, right? So it takes a little bit. So those who are translating it, they can figure that out for us, and they put those periods and the paragraph breaks. They help us understand that. But when you read it in the Greek, you can understand how they're just giving us one thing that happened, another thing happened, and another thing happened, another thing happened, and they don't put in there all the time that, a couple weeks later this happened. So they don't give us those paragraph breaks in there, and that's important as we keep this in mind as we look at Matthew. So Matthew's key points for his whole gospel of the empty tomb, he has 6 points he wants to make to us. That's it. He wants us to make 6 points. He wants us to know that people, in this case the women, people went to the tomb and when? All right, so they went to the tomb in the morning. He wants us to know that the tomb was opened by divine action. The angel opened up the tomb. He wants us to know that the guards saw the empty tomb. He wants us to know that the angel told the women that Jesus is risen and that Jesus would meet the disciples in Galilee. He wants us to know that the women saw Jesus alive in the flesh, because it talks here about they clasped his feet, his actual physical feet. It wasn't the spirit of Jesus. He was bodily risen. And that he confirmed
outside of the tomb.
They'd be outside. And I think it doesn't say, but I really believe it was outside the tomb there is when Jesus met the women. Okay? And then finally, he wants us to know the guards ran ahead of the women and told the Pharisees and all that about the tomb. That's what is important to Matthew. That's all he wants us to know. He doesn't tell us that the women went back to talk to the disciples. He doesn't tell us the conversation of the disciples. He doesn't tell us about Peter and John running back to the tomb and seeing. He doesn't get into any of that. For Matthew, it's not important. That's not what I need you to know. I need you to know these 6 things. People went to the tomb. What day they went to the tomb. That it was opened by divine action. That the guards saw it first because they're going to start this conspiracy. The angel talked to the women. Jesus talked to the women. And the guards and the Pharisees have this conspiracy going. That's what I need you to know. That's your takeaway. Follow me? So that's Matthew's take and his important points. But wait, what exactly did the angel say to the women? So quickly, these are all the different accounts, right? They said, don't be afraid. For I know that you're looking for Jesus. He was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, Jesus said. Just as he said, come and see the place where he lay. Go quickly and tell his disciples he is risen from the dead and he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you. Over here, don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where he lay. Go and tell his disciples and Peter. He is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as I have told you. Notice that Mark, remember Mark and Peter were buddies? Remember, he makes sure to put Peter in there. Right? He says, go tell the disciples. He's over here. He's like, oh yeah, don't forget. He told me to. Don't forget to tell him. He told me to. Luke, why do you look for the living among the dead? He's not here. He's risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee. The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinners, be crucified on the 3rd day, and be raised again. And then here the angel asks, why are you crying? Very different narrative happening here, but I'm going to tell you why. John's in a whole different part of the story. So what did the angels say? They said all of this. They said some fashion of all of this, all right? It's not a word. The Bible doesn't quote necessarily word for word for word. It doesn't. It summarizes what things are said. I think they quote Jesus very carefully, all right? But all scholars, they agree that the gospel writers, they're telling us basically what was said, but it's not always word for word, and that's important to know. Doesn't mean there's a contradiction, doesn't mean that we can parse out the words, doesn't mean that we can say, oh, it's not reliable. It is reliable. But the angel said all of some variety of all of this. Basically, that he is not here, that he is risen. Jesus is going to be in Galilee. Go tell the disciples. That's what the angel said. Now, what did the women report to the others? Here is where it really gets complicated for those who want to just look at this casually and criticize it. It's easy to criticize if you're not paying attention. So in Matthew, so the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and then ran to tell his disciples. That's all Matthew tells us. He doesn't get into what the women told the disciples back in the city. Mark says this, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. This gets interesting. The end. Did you know that in the oldest manuscripts, this is where the book of Mark ends, right here? The last several verses of Mark are not in the original manuscripts. This is where Mark ends his story. Now, a lot of critics like to look at Mark and say, Mark denied the resurrection. He doesn't even get into the resurrection. He doesn't even talk about it. He says the women went to the tomb, they found it empty, and they're not sure why, and they ran away and they were afraid. This here that I've highlighted, this is what comes after. When Jesus was early on the first day, he met with Mary. All scholars agree this was not part of Mark's original gospel, but it was added later. And they've studied how it was written, and they are not concerned. They don't think that it's a forgery. It's not. It was just what Mark, in all likelihood, added to his gospel in later manuscripts. All right? But this is interesting as we looked at that. Because he does not deny the resurrection. Mark, in chapter 8, he tells us about it. He says it right there. He says, and he, Jesus, began to teach. The Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. 3 days rise again. So Mark tells us, Jesus says this, and then in his account of the empty tomb, he finishes the story. Don't be alarmed, the angel says. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He's not here. See the place where we laid him. Go tell the disciples and Peter. He is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you back in chapter 8. So Mark, he deals with the resurrection. He says it happened. He says right there it happened. All right? And I want to give you a quick story here. Real quick story. Harrison Ford. It relates, believe it or not. You know Harrison Ford. You guys know the story about how he got into acting? It's kind of an interesting little story. So he was in a movie called American Graffiti. It was George Lucas's first movie, right? Played a small role in American Graffiti. Didn't get many acting roles after that. Years later, he has to make a living, so he gets back to work as a carpenter, which he was, and he was building out kitchen cabinets and kitchen finishes for some of the most wealthy in Hollywood, producers and directors and stars at the time. Finds himself at one point on a crew redoing the kitchen inside the home of none other than George Lucas, the guy that directed the American Graffiti movie he was in earlier. George Lucas recognizes him and says, hey, yeah, you were American Graffiti with me. You did good. George Lucas says, I'm casting for this crazy sci-fi movie that I'm getting ready to do that probably going to go nowhere, but I need some help. You're an actor, you know how to read. He says, I could use some help. Could you come in and just read scripts to the people that I'm auditioning for the different parts? That's all he asked Harrison Ford to do. Just come in and read a part so that they can look at these people over here and decide which ones they want to cast. Carrie Fisher, Mark Hamill, Kurt Russell, by the way, he auditioned for one of the roles, right? In that process, while Harrison Ford is reading these scripts to these actors who are auditioning, George Lucas realizes he likes how Harrison Ford is reading his particular scripts and offers him a part in this crazy new movie. And that's how that happened.
That's funny.
How does that relate to the Gospels? Here's how. I didn't tell you that Harrison Ford went on to play the role of Han Solo, that he went on to play another iconic role, Indiana Jones, right? Why didn't I tell you that? Because you know that. You guys know that story. That's the rest of the story that you know. I just want to tell you the interesting story that came before that, leading up to that point. At this point, when Mark writes his gospel, 30, 40 years later, the story of Jesus is well known. People know about the risen Jesus. They know about the risen Jesus. They've heard from the hundreds of people who saw him and met him. They know all about that. What Mark, in all likelihood, is wanting to tell them is the part they probably don't know. Everything leading up to that point. Everything leading up to the empty tomb, which is why Mark probably didn't feel like it was necessary to go into the whole part about everything else that he has risen. And he just didn't initially, because you know that part. So that explains why Mark's gospel, in all likelihood, stops right there, because it was, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story that you know, right? Mark understands, you guys know the rest of the story. I just wanted to get you up to the empty tomb because everything else beyond that is history. So then Luke, when they came back, they told the 11 and all the others, it was Mary, Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them. They told us the apostles, but they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. John. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, they've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they've put him. Now that's a whole different story, right? Now why does she say that? What is going on here? This is where it gets really interesting. This is where critics think they've got us in a gotcha moment, and they don't. I'm sorry, they just don't. Here's what happened here. Remember the guards report? Remember while the women were on their way to the tomb, the guards had already saw the empty tomb. They ran back and they told the Pharisees and the chief priests what happened, what they saw. We saw this angel. We were scared to death. The tomb was empty. The Pharisees said, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to tell people the tomb was robbed, that the disciples came and stole the body. They're already back in Jerusalem, the guards are, telling this story in a community the size of Chapel Glen. Now imagine if something as powerful as the crucifixion of Jesus had happened here in Chapel Glen. It was the news everywhere. Everybody was talking about it. Word spread quickly, especially in a community like that where, here we live inside our homes, we stay inside our houses. There, you have a small house, you're outside, you're working. It's easy to get word around. So word was spreading that the disciples, and not the 12, okay? We're talking it could have been any one of the many disciples that are following Jesus that they think stole the body. What happened in the likelihood is the disciples probably heard, some of them probably heard that story before the women even got back to Jerusalem. So the women get back to Jerusalem. They tell some of the disciples what they saw, and they're like, what are you talking about? No, it was stolen. We've already heard. Somebody stole the body. And the women are like, no, but we saw an angel. I don't know what you saw, but forget it. Here's something else that's important to know. Very, very important to know. Don't shoot the messenger. A woman's testimony was not highly regarded among the Jews in that day. Really important to know that. In a trial,
It's so shocking that he includes the women so much.
That's why. In my opinion, that's why. And that answers a criticism. A woman's testimony, according to Jewish custom, not according to the Bible, but according to Jewish custom, a woman's testimony was not reliable. It was not believable. So when the women are coming back and they're telling the men what happened, the men are like, no, we've already heard, the body was stolen, you're mistaken. I think after they heard that enough times as they're going around the city, early in that morning, even the women start to question themselves. Even the women now are not sure, okay, wait a minute, no, Mary, you were there, Salome, what, you heard it, right? Yeah, but they're saying the body, I guess they probably did steal the body. Maybe that's what happened. I don't know. The women are doubting themselves now. By the time they get to some of the disciples, as John records here, they are questioning themselves. And so there was chaos and confusion back in Jerusalem. There was chaos going on. All right? So the Pharisees, they'd been sowing doubt among the people in Jerusalem that the body had been stolen way before the women even got back. For probably an hour, it could have been a couple of hours, this story had been circulating through town. By the time the women get back, they're hearing a whole different story, and they're not even believing their own eyes now. So the women heard the false story from the other people. Even the disciples began to doubt even their own encounter at the tomb. This is not just my interpretation, but there's others, I've read many commentaries that say this is probably what was going on. And it makes perfect sense now when you look at that, when you put them all together. Here's another bit of evidence that proves this. This is from Luke. This is in his gospel. This is the road to Emmaus. We've heard this one, but let's look at this real quick. Now, the same day, two of them, disciples, were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were walking with each other and talking about everything that had happened. This was big news. Don't forget this. This was a big, big deal. That Jesus lived, he had his ministry, that he was challenging the Pharisees, he was embarrassing the Pharisees, he was making them look like fools because they don't know their own scriptures. Now Pontius Pilate crucifies him. This was the biggest news of the day at the time. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked, "What are you discussing together as you walk?" And then they said, they stood with their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have been happening here in these days?" This was a big deal. Meaning, when the guards got back before the women even got to the tomb, started their lie, wildfire. And so when did Jesus appear to Mary? John says, right down here, "At this she turned and she saw Jesus standing there, but didn't realize it was him. 'Woman, why are you crying?' the angel asked. 'Who is it you're looking for?' thinking he was a gardener. Now, it was Jesus who said this, excuse me. She said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him." She's gone back to the tomb now. After going to the city, hearing the story, thinking that she's mistaken, now she goes back to the tomb with Peter and John, and now she's sad because now she thinks the body's been stolen, and that's what she's saying to Jesus here. And then Jesus says, "Mary." And when he says her name, she recognizes who he is. And she says, "Rabboni," teacher. Now she recognizes him. So then Matthew, "So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell the disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them." This is again after she goes back to the tomb the second time. All the scholars agree. Mary and probably some of the other women went back to the tomb a second time with Peter and John. So the events that involving the women returning to the city, reporting to the others how Peter and John returned to the tomb with the women, they all took place between verses 8 and 9. But if you read it, it doesn't read that way. So the women hurried from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly, Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, worshipped him. Suddenly. We see the word suddenly, and we think it means immediately, right after, she goes to see the disciples. But everything involving them giving the report, John and Peter going back to the tomb, she goes back to the tomb, all of that happens between here. What Matthew is saying is that it happens suddenly that Jesus appeared to her. Not suddenly right after she goes to tell the first time. He says that's the end of it. Remember how it reads in the Greek, right? No paragraph marks, no periods, nothing, right? So that's what's happening here as we try to read this in our own sort of, Western English mindset. We miss these points. No, what he's saying is that it happened suddenly to her, that Jesus suddenly appeared. Then we can see from John's account that she was confused herself until Jesus spoke to her, telling us when Jesus appeared to Mary. It happened after Mary went back the second time. Now, wrapping it up here, getting close to the end here. This is important. So Mark tells us that when they heard that Jesus was alive and she said had seen him, they did not believe it. Afterwards, Jesus appeared in different forms to people walking on that road to Emmaus in the country. These returned and reported to the rest, but they still did not believe them either. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating, and he rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen, right? So they didn't believe it. The women came back to tell them they just didn't believe it. They had probably had that lie in their head, and they were obstinate. They were not going to believe it. So the story of the empty tomb is one, told by 4 people, written to different audiences, with very different points of view regarding details that they know to be or believe to be important to the audiences that they were writing to. Now, when you put it all together, the gospel, according to Todd. I'm just going to briefly summarize for you. This is my best good faith effort to try to put the timeline together and explain what happened the morning of the resurrection. This is not just me, but this is different commentaries that I've read. Not they all don't agree, and I cannot promise you that this is exactly how it happened, but this is a good faith interpretation of how it happened. Okay? So, early in the morning, probably before the sun even came up, the stone was rolled away, and the guards were terrified, and the guards left early in the morning. They run back to Jerusalem to tell the Pharisees what happened. In the meantime, Mary is up. It's early. She's going from house to house. They're collecting themselves together. They meet over here at this house. They meet over here at this house. Because the women prepared the night before. They're going to go to the tomb the next morning. They're on the way up to the tomb. They get to the tomb. The stone's been rolled away. There's an angel there. They see inside the tomb. The tomb is empty. The angel says all the things that the angels say to the women. Women are excited. They run back. They tell the disciples. But it's too late. They get back to Jerusalem, and the lie has already been spreading for a few hours probably. Now they're confused because they're hearing from the other disciples that the body's been stolen. They're questioning themselves. They're questioning their own eyes and their own ears. They tell Peter and John. And they're like, but come see us. Come see the tomb. So Peter and John get up and run. Mark records Peter and John run to the tomb, And John makes a point to make sure that even though John got there first, and then Peter was the first one to look in. So John I just want you to know, I got there first, I won the race, right? But Mary and probably other women, they go with the disciples. They go with Peter and John. They go back to the tomb to see the tomb for a second time. Then the men leave. It's at that time that Jesus appears to Mary and confirms what the angel said. I'm going to go to Galilee, tell the disciples, we're going to meet in Galilee. And so they go back and they tell the disciples, and then finally they go and they meet in Galilee. And then Jesus appears to the 2 on the road to Emmaus. Then he appears to the 11, and then finally even to Paul. And he appears to, over the course of 40 days, to 500 people.